The British campaigns in Burma against the Japanese were the most vicious and bitter conflicts of the Second World War. Dubbed the Forgotten War, British forces fought the Japanese in a war zone the size of Western Europe through dense jungle and over rugged mountains. A total of 615,000 tons of supplies, 315,000 reinforcements and 210,000 casualties were transported by air between 1941 and the end of 1945. 101 battle honours and 29 Victoria Crosses were won by the Forgotten Army, which was a feat unequalled in any war zone. The 14th Army was over 1 million strong, with Gurkha and Indian soldiers making up 65% of the biggest Commonwealth army ever assembled. This is their story. During the 1930s, the British led a cosy colonial existence in the new age of the aeroplane.
The whole world is knit by the aeroplane, and Rangoon Airport is not only a social centre where aerial gymkhanas may form the excuse to meet and talk, but a nerve centre which
Before December 1941, few could have seen that the peaceful British colony of Burma, now renamed Myanmar, would become a bloody battleground for 4 long years.
I think to more easily understand why Britain was in the Far East at this period of time, one must remember that she'd, over many, many years, built up a trading empire in the Far East. Because she was a manufacturing country, she needed the Far East raw materials and also needed the Far Eastern countries as markets. So she had expanded her power through India, Burma, Malaya, Singapore, British North Borneo, until she controlled a whole swathe of territories in the Far East. And this was all made possible by the power of the Royal Navy, which was the supreme maritime force at that period of time. In the early 1920s, Japan began to try and extend her colonial empire. And she decided to do this by invading China and turning China into a colonial empire of her own, or at least one large part of it, Manchuria. So from this period onwards, relations with Japan deteriorated. The West were appalled at her savagery against the Chinese, and also for her invasion of China. And so from the 1920s onward, the situation deteriorated. And those friendly relations that had existed before, based on service together in the First World War, came to an end now, and Japan felt more and more isolated by the condemnation of Western powers. China seemed a very attractive target to Japan. It was large, backward, chaotic, and also riven by internal dissension between nationalists and communists. So therefore, in 1931, the Japanese army engineered an incident at Mukden, which gave them a reason to enter hostilities with China. Again, in 1937, she engineered a similar provocation to even increase more her efforts to subjugate China. China actually resisted much more determinedly than Japan had expected.
China's untrained millions under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek learnt to fight.
This led to bloody fighting and great slaughter, particularly in Shanghai. Then subsequently, what was known as the Nanking, where the atrocities inflicted upon the civilian population were truly horrific.
Therefore, we decided that we must change our policy in the Far East. We could no longer rely entirely on the British Navy to protect our possessions in the Far East. We therefore had to be able to hold on until what was called the main fleet should arrive from Europe to relieve our colonial possessions. That is why we built up the fortress of Singapore. It was a fortress insofar as it was a fortress against naval attack. It was never intended as a fortress against land attack. The idea was that having built up a fortress that could repel naval attack with its huge guns and bunkers and massive ammunition capability and resupplies all underground, that would buy time for the main fleet to come from the United Kingdom and defeat the enemy's fleet. What, of course, it didn't allow for was the fact that the main fleet would be tied up fighting a war against Germany in Europe.
More and more in distant parts of the empire, defence devolves upon air power. And today, that strategic outpost, Singapore, is the scene of intense aerial activity. Blenheim bombers are among the types operating here as the squadrons fly among the tropic clouds over the island city.
The RAF offered to defend it with air power, and over the years built a series of airfields in the region to provide bases. The Navy relied on coastal artillery and some surplus 15-inch, 9.2-inch and some 6-inch guns.
Stamford Raffles, who founded Singapore in 1819, would be astonished at this amazing development. British warplanes over the commercial airport of this vital gateway between India and China, a place that was once no more than a jungle swamp. And of course, the anti-aircraft defences of this great naval base are equally important. Indian troops, fighting men from the land of the five rivers, the Punjab, man the AA guns, practicing at a sleeve target. Enemy planes attempting a raid on Singapore would be given a hot reception from these loyal defenders of the empire, who are fully trained in the handling of all the latest weapons. Here they're using 4.5s, and pretty warm work it is in the steamy heat of the equator.
When we arrived in Singapore, naturally we formed our own impressions, and they were pretty gloomy because there was hardly any visible defense in Singapore. It was not afoot to describe it as that the press did at home to cheer people up as a fortress, would be quite wrong.
Naval defense involves daily mine-sweeping patrols through the straits and among the narrow approaches to Singapore. All shipping to and from the east must pass here, and so the work is vital. It's largely carried out by Malays who are born seamen. Offensive exercises are also to be observed on the shimmering waters that surround the island, as for instance torpedo bombing.
The RAF in 1941 was supposed to have 500 aircraft, but only 150 were available. Many were obsolete types, such as the Vickers Wildebeest.
The modern European tactics of aerial and naval combat.
The Wildebeest was only capable of 100 miles an hour. Fortifications in the area were negligible to protect rubber production that was desperately needed at home. Malaya, north of Singapore on the borders of Burma, was put on alert as the Japanese threat became reality.
Malaya is on guard, and manoeuvres can be observed in many parts of the country. Here, for instance, on a rubber estate, where a Malay unit receives instructions from a British officer in the art of modern warfare. Of course, war in Malaya would be very largely war in the jungle, and this is just where the Malays would prove their quality. The Malayan forest is about the thickest in the world, and progress through it is impossible except by hacking out a path. In such conditions, to ambush the enemy is a comparatively simple job for these men who know the lie of the land and the way of the jungle. The familiar Bren carrier has its uses even in Malaya. It can't penetrate the jungle, but it can operate on its fringe. These are men of the loyal North Lancashire Regiment.
the rugged jungle terrain in Malaya was to pose similar problems as in Burma.
Join the army and see the world.
The Burma Road, which was opened in 1938, was intended to help the Chinese in their resistance to the Japanese. The supply route was crucial to the Chinese. For that reason, no fewer than 200,000 labourers were used for the task of building it. Some equipment and expertise was provided by the Americans in constructing this 350-mile-long road from northeast Burma through to the Yunnan province in China.
And by 1938, the Burma Road was supplying large quantities of supplies to the Chinese to enable them to combat the Japanese, which they were doing quite successfully. Once war with Germany had started, Japan started to make more and more demands for Britain, who had the control of Burma, to stop these supplies going to the Chinese. Britain, at this time, fighting for her life against Germany, this is the time of Dunkirk and the Battle of Britain, was prepared to close the road for a short period of time. But following American pressure, reopened it again. And this became yet another reason for the Japanese to feel antagonistic towards the British, their old allies.
When news came that coolies were loading up hundreds of lorries ready for the opening of the Burma Road, I think everyone in Britain regarded the event as definitely good news. And now war supplies are steadily on their way to the Chinese army again. Japan's reply is to bomb the Burma Road, but the Chinese have probably taken precautions against this with labor ready to repair the route and, let's hope, well-placed anti-aircraft batteries. China's own air force is also growing in strength and skill, so the Japanese bombers won't have it all their own way. General Chiang Kai-shek has unlimited manpower to call upon. With sound training and with munitions of war from outside, they can continue to resist the Japanese.
When Germany overran Europe in 1940, Japan wanted to take her pick of the Dutch and French colonies without military confrontation with America. It wanted to seize the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, Siam, French Indochina and Burma to establish a strong defensive perimeter south of China. With the newly won vast stock of rubber, timber, tin and oil, Japan hoped that America and war-weary Britain would accept her new gains as a fait accompli. After all, Japan had seen how Britain, Holland and France had used naked force to seize their colonies in the Far East. This full-blown war between China and Japan was north of Burma's borders.
Been making a combined plan to resist aggression should it spread further. In the Far East showed a new development when the Japanese pushed into northern Indochina. There was French resistance and there were Japanese casualties.
War Office in quite early on in 1941 became convinced that things were likely to go off in the Far East because the French had been forced to let the Japanese into Thailand.
But the Japanese reached a strategic point from which to bomb the newly opened Burma Road, and French colonial troops were captured in the course of the fighting. Then the Japanese Navy took a hand, a squadron steaming to Haiphong, port of Hanoi, the capital. Negotiations followed, and there go the officers to speak for France. At the conference, the Japanese demanded bases in Indochina and got them.
And the Japanese were ensconcing themselves in Bangkok and everywhere. And it was obvious that this was very dangerous for Malaya and in particular Singapore.
When the Japanese invaded French Indochina, the Americans froze all Japanese assets in the US. This in effect amounted to an embargo on the Japan and the most crucial product of all, petrol and other oil products.
And here's quite another story, one that I wouldn't advise anyone to doubt. The departure of troops from Australia on their way to reinforce Singapore.
Singapore had become the key to Britain's Far Eastern interests, including Burma. Singapore's defences were vital as the central linchpin of resistance to any aggressor with an eye on Malaya and Burma.
And here, nicely camouflaged, is a nice little welcome for any invader who feels like taking a chance. 12-inch howitzers are just one item in the scheme of coast defence, and the 750-pound shells are only one of the generous arrangements made by Britain's reception committee.
They had an elaborate machinery and made cranking noises, and I saw them turned round once. At least one big gun turned round and fired, and it made a noise like a steam train taking off. Fire!
The defence of Singapore and the Malay Peninsula being vital to Empire strategy, our Far Eastern Commander-in-Chief, Air Marshal Brooke Popham, sees to it that the Imperial forces are thoroughly trained. So it's tough going for the troops, whether Aussie, Scot or Malay. For there are many enemies to fight, even on manoeuvres. The jungle itself and the swamps, to say nothing of the tropical heat. Yes, it's tough going, all right, and a genuine Malay swamp doesn't taste good or improve a rifle. The defence of Malaya, nevertheless, is a vital point.
American public opinion was reluctant for war with anybody, be it Japan or Germany. America was prepared to help Britain to resist Germany with lease lend, and would give aid to China through the Burma Road. Colonel Knox, the US Navy Secretary, made plain US support for Britain in one of his speeches.
We must make our promise good to give aid to Britain. We must see the job through. All of this is needed for our own safety and our own future security. This is our fight.
An example of lease lend were squadrons of Brewster Buffaloes.
Handy American fighters flown by pilots from Britain, Australia and New Zealand.
The Brewster Buffalo was supposed to be a fast and maneuverable modern fighter, but it was completely outclassed by the Japanese Zero, a fact not appreciated by the British at that time.
Over the jungle, the aircraft practice in dogfights and carry-on patrol, ready if the time comes to win the Battle of Malaya. We have America to thank for these fine aircraft, which are a great contribution to the strength of the RAF in this area.
But the final build-up to a full-scale war with Japan in the Far East came in December 1941, when Burma's fate was to be sealed. Japanese Admiral Yamamoto launched his surprise attack on the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had long accepted that if they were to drive towards the South Pacific and Southeast Asia, the American Pacific Fleet based at Hawaii needed to be neutralized. In an imitation of the British attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto, the Japanese were determined to launch a surprise attack to catch the US fleet at anchor. The Americans were completely surprised on the 8th of December 1941. In spite of their superior intelligence resources and the fact that they had radar, which picked up the Japanese planes as they flew into the attack, the Americans mistook the Japanese planes for their own flying fortresses returning to base. American surprise was compounded by the fact that the Japanese postponed negotiations till the very last minute. The Japanese had planned to present their ultimatum of war at the precise moment that the attack was launched, but this action was delayed for a few hours until after the attack. When the Japanese struck, the blow was devastating. 6 of the American battleships in harbor were badly damaged or sunk. Fortunately, the American carrier fleet was out at sea on exercise. And in the war that was to unfold, the use of carriers was to become paramount. The Americans dubbed these treacherous Japanese actions on the 8th of December 1941 a day of infamy. On the same day, the British lost 2 ships on their way to Singapore. Force Z, the battleship Prince of Wales, and the battlecruiser Repulse should have been joined by the aircraft carrier Indomitable, but it ran aground in the West Indies. These 3 ships were to be used in an attempt to intercept the Japanese landings on the Malay Peninsula. But the Japanese had spotted the 2 remaining ships and launched 80 aircraft to attack them. The Prince of Wales had the best anti-aircraft defences in the British Navy, but when the attack came, the defence of both the Prince of Wales and Repulse were completely overwhelmed, and the 2 ships were sunk with great loss of life.
What we have to realise is that once the Prince of Wales and Repulse had gone, that was really the end of the Navy in the Far East. They had no modern capital ships left capable of fighting the Japanese, and apart from a small presence in the Indian Ocean, they were incapable of resisting the Japs.
Simultaneously with the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese landed in Malaya.
All the early reports from Malaya spoke of heavy and confused fighting, with the Japanese gaining ground. Among troops defending the land are Gurkhas, who were soon in action. This is typical Malayan country, almost the only place in which troops can deploy being the plantation. The Gurkha, though fully trained in all arms, takes particular pleasure in killing his enemy with his kukri. It's said the Japanese have already found this out. In Singapore, the last of the Japanese to leave got away just before hostilities began. As for the searching, although it looks thorough, it seems almost over-polite. None of them will be half as well off in their own country as they have been in Singapore. They went off in a big Japanese ship just as more British reinforcements were arriving.
Planning for the defence of Malaya had been based on one fact which proved to be disastrously wrong, that the Air Force would be mainly responsible for obtaining air cover and air superiority. This they lost in the first 2 or 3 days, but it also left the army completely wrongly deployed, trying to look after airfields which had no further use. Add to that a plan half implemented to go into Thailand and try and forestall the Japanese invasion there, and the whole method of trying to oppose the Japanese was faulty. Step by step, the British forces were driven south down the peninsula of Malaya, quite unable to cope with the Japanese enveloping tactics because their jungle training simply wasn't sufficient to allow them to combat the Japanese in the jungle, whereas the Japanese were extremely well trained as far as jungle warfare was concerned and didn't find it too difficult to hook behind the British forces and place roadblocks behind them, which forced the British forces to keep withdrawing, which they had to do right down the Malayan Peninsula.
When the war spread to the Far East, Singapore knew, of course, that the Strait settlements and all Malaya would be in the thick of it. Japanese were promptly rounded up in Singapore and taken away for internment. The Japanese, who have carried on many trades and professions in Malaya, have had one favorite trade, that of spying. Singapore's first blitz came within a few hours of the opening of hostilities from Japanese planes off an aircraft carrier, and a number of bombs falling in a Chinese district of the city caused much havoc and many casualties among the civil population.
With the Japanese overrunning Malaya, it meant that they had formed a solid wedge between Singapore to the south, with Thailand and Burma in the north now becoming very vulnerable to attack.
As the retreat continued and places were abandoned, local inhabitants took as much as they could from the shops so as not to leave anything for the Japanese. Certainly a scorched earth policy has been carried out in many areas. Bridges have been blown up, factories and stations destroyed, and much damage done to add to the destruction wrought by the enemy himself.
They also used small boats to move down the coast and cut off the defenders once again. With the Royal Navy virtually destroyed, the British could do little to stop this.
Meanwhile, gaining early command of the air, the Jap continued to bomb and fight his way south.
The British retreated to Singapore.
The tide of invasion swept forward, and in a few weeks it was lapping almost the last lines of defense on the mainland north of Singapore itself. Much needed material had been reaching Singapore, and it was a race between the speed of the invaders' advance and the speed with which the Allies could send men and weapons to stiffen the defense.
The capital of Burma, Rangoon, was now a Japanese target.
Rangoon is quite as much in the news as Singapore, for the Japanese, always hoping to cut off supplies to China, have been attacking strongly from Thailand. But the Burmese capital, though bombed, has been carrying on its normal existence. This lovely city, with its famous pagodas, is of the first importance to Allied strategy. Its docks didn't suffer badly in early raids, and the flow of supplies reaching Rangoon from the sea, 20 miles away, continued through on their way to China. More air raid shelters were constructed as Rangoon recovered from the first shock of meeting death from the sky. Damage was done, of course, and a number of people, not unnaturally, fled from the town to the protection of the country. Here at a suburban station, Sir Reginald Dorman Smith, the governor, together with the Burmese premier, Sir Paul Tun, are meeting a trainload of evacuees returning to Rangoon. Among others, Sir Reginald spoke with this Burmese whose wife was killed in a raid. He visited a food centre for the bombed out. And he congratulated the men of a Rangoon fire station who did such excellent work in carrying out the slogan of the moment, as did all the ARP services. If the Jap Air Force thought it had a clear field in Burma, it was mistaken. 40 Japanese aircraft were shot down during the first 2 raids on the city. Tomahawks and buffaloes fairly tore into the enemy bombers and shot them to pieces. And the pieces did much to maintain confidence among the people. For this good result, much credit goes to the AVG, or American Volunteer Group. These fighter pilots were originally trained to help the Chinese in the direct defense of the Burma Road. Now they cooperate with the Royal Air Force in the direct defense of Rangoon.
The American Volunteer Group, or Flying Tigers, so known because of the bared fangs painted on the noses of their P-40 Tomahawk fighters, had been raised by General Claire Chennault in 1940 to aid the Chinese against the Japanese. In 1941, and over the course of 2 days in December, shot down no fewer than 30 Japanese machines. Eventually, of course, the Japanese presence on the ground became too strong, and with only 10 planes left, the Flying Tigers were withdrawn.
On Singapore Island, General Percival, the British commander, had over 100,000 more men than the attacking Japanese. Unfortunately, the failure of military and civil authorities to work together never allowed a proper defence plan to be set up, even though there was plenty of time to do so. Corporal Charles Peel was supposed to go to the Middle East, but he was diverted at the very last minute.
All our equipment had already gone on ahead of us to Basra. And when we left Durban, instead of going north as we would do to get to the Middle East, the boat turned east and landed us in Singapore. We found that the town itself was being bombed by the Japanese at that time. Our job then, of course, with the 35th Light Act Regiment was to, again, to feed them. They'd gone up into Malaya, and we had to follow them from Singapore. On more than one occasion, we had the Japs behind us as well as in front. And if you can imagine the feeling of that, it's rather debilitating, to say the least. And the Japanese did a vile thing here. They managed to get all the civilian population of Malaya on the move to come down and down Malaya, and eventually finished up across the causeway into Singapore. And in the last few days, I couldn't move my vehicles at all. There were bullock carts, lorries, cars, everything just left in the middle of the roads. And we had to push some of them out, not only physically, but use the vehicles as well, just to push them out off the road.
When the attack came, General Percival attempted to defend the 70-mile-long Singapore coastline. His forces were dispersed too thinly, and once the Japanese were ashore, the end came quickly.
We managed to eventually get down to Singapore. They blew up the causeway, and unfortunately, by doing so, they also cut off the water supply to Singapore.
Singapore fell on the 15th of February.
We blew our guns up. Very dangerous operation, blowing up field guns. You're more in danger close to something that's being blown up than you are being bombarded by the enemy.
Although General Percival would like to have launched a last-ditch counterattack, his subordinates were against it.
General Percival surrendered Singapore on the 14th of February 1942. As Churchill said in his war memoirs, the single biggest disaster to strike Britain in World War II. And yet, ironically enough, the commanding Japanese General Yamashita felt that had the British made a counterattack at that stage, the Japanese, who'd outrun their supplies, would have been very hard pushed to keep them back and might well have had to retreat out of the island. But the attack never came, and the Japanese pressed their advantage.
We were told then that we were prisoners of war. I suppose there was some kind of relief, because at least you could stand up without being shot at. But that didn't last long, and you became very worried then about that you let your family, your country, and yourself down for no fault whatsoever of your own. You're terribly angry about the people who put you in such a position when you had no retaliation whatsoever. Singapore was a place that they termed as the fortress of Singapore, but it was nothing of the kind. There were no things to stop the Japs from getting into Singapore at all. And it was here that we heard what they had done to the Alexandra Hospital in Singapore. On the 13th, 14th of February, they had broken into the hospital and killed all the inmates in the hospital, the doctors, even the chaps on the operating theatre. And all the ancillary staff were coupled up, tied in pairs, back to back, and put into buildings outside, about 240. And the following day, they were taken out and shot. That is what we had to put up with. That was the feeling of what happened in Singapore.
As America mobilized, the Japanese tide swept over the western Pacific Islands, engulfed Burma and the Malay states, and drove Britain from her vital naval stronghold of Singapore.
All the oil storage tanks all around the islands of Singapore had been breached and the oil set afire. Our ammunition all our rifles and revolvers and everything else had to be placed in a certain place under Japanese guard. And we had to carry everything we wanted the 15 miles to Changi. We were then put into about 1,000 man units, of which we had our own kitchen. There was no electricity or gas, and the only way that we could get the fires working was to get wood to burn. To ask an English cook to cook rice for 1,000 men, and very bad rice at that at this time, is something that's got to be seen to be believed. To have with it was a kind of watery vegetable stew. And this went on now for about 3 months, when we saw very, very little of the Japanese at this time. The next thing that happened was the first sign of malnutrition. Due to this diet that we're having at this time, with very little vitamin B in it, everybody, including all the officers as well as all the other ranks, caught this thing called scrotum dermatitis. It's known by the POWs as Changi balls.
After the fall of Singapore, the Japanese then advanced on Rangoon, the Burmese capital.
If you look at a map of Burma, you'll see that Rangoon can so easily be cut off to the north. But you'll also see that it is really the major port into Burma. And that's why it was important for the British to hang on to Rangoon, because it was the only place they could bring in reinforcements to fight against the Japanese. Now, General Hutton, the original commander of all forces in Burma, had felt that it was hopeless to hold Rangoon and had actually put supply dumps further up country in case we had to withdraw out of the whole of south of Burma, including Rangoon. But when General Alexander took over, he determined to hang on to Rangoon for as long as he could, because he wanted to get in reinforcements. And in fact, in that he was successful, because he got in the single most effective formation, the 7th Armour Brigade, which had been a battle-tried formation in the desert, fighting against Rommel. They got in time and actually were key to the subsequent success of the British getting out of Burma intact. However, Rangoon had to be given up, and Alexander nearly left it too late. The Japanese had, in fact, cut off all the roads north of Rangoon. But fortunately, one Japanese commander totally misinterpreted his orders and left one road open, through which the extremely grateful British forces, including 7th Armour Brigade, poured north.
In the Far East, the battle of communications continues, and although the Japanese hold Rangoon and the south of Burma, British and Chinese resistance has decidedly not weakened. Lease lend material has helped the Chinese in their fight, and Chinese troops using the Burma Road in the opposite direction have come in from Yunnan province to play their part in slowing up the Japanese advance. And of course the Burma Road, winding its hazardous way from Lashio to Chungking, has had to take more than its share of traffic, and that means hard labor for all concerned. 250,000 laborers eat a lot of rice. And malaria, among other things, must be controlled. Riverbanks are sprayed with arsenic dust in the war on mosquitoes, and quinine is distributed. Go on, take it, and don't spit it out.
And so, from the capital Rangoon, the British troops were being steadily pushed back, often across country, towards the Indian borders.
Though the situation remains very serious, yet the Japanese blitz which swept over Malaya, the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies was certainly slowed up in Burma. British, Burmese and Indian troops have fought a dogged rearguard action against heavy odds, taking toll of the enemy and contesting every inch of the way. These are pictures from some of the earlier fighting when our forces counterattacked and recaptured Shuegyin, a strategic point on the Sitang River, about halfway between Rangoon and Taungu. Our troops cleared the town in 6 hours and so for about the first time in Burma had the Japs on the run. The town had been bombed by the enemy before and was badly knocked about. General Alexander, commanding our troops in Burma, is seen with the general who recaptured the town. One of our big handicaps out there has been the 5th Column. He's a Burman, a 5th Column leader being brought in by one of the Burma Rifles. And by way of contrast, chiefs from the southern Shan states renewing their pledge of full cooperation in a meeting with the governor, Sir Reginald Dorman Smith. More recently, the Chinese have sent in reinforcements to relieve pressure on weary Allied troops, and they've been putting up a stubborn resistance. Chiang Kai-shek himself flew to Lashio with his wife. He has done more than any living man to weld the Chinese into one nation to resist Japan. His wife has played a tremendous part in his epic struggle. A brilliant personality and a fitting consort to such a great leader as the Generalissima.
In spite of the friendly Burmese hill tribes and limited help from the Chinese, the defence of Burma became more of a desperate struggle as the weeks went by. Japanese forces literally razed towns and villages to the ground as they continued to advance through Burma. They were covered by overwhelming air power.
Inspiring pictures in all this part of the Burma campaign. Thousands of poor Burmese people here were rendered homeless.
Finally, during the long retreat, all the British forces could do was destroy everything and anything that might help the Japanese, especially the strategically vital oil fields at Yenyanyong.
Scorched earth is a phrase which this war has made familiar to us all. Here from Burma is a clear picture of just what that phrase means. Burma, with all its mineral wealth, was lost, we are told, when Rangoon was lost, and our men cut off from the sea could only fall back slowly, scorching the earth as they went. Of the total wealth of Burma, the most important item was the oil. Any and all of the machinery that drew oil from the earth was therefore smashed in a systematic orgy of destruction. The wooden derricks were set ablaze. Japan, in General Alexander's view, will be unable to extract any benefit from the fields of Yenyanyang for at least a year. Oil reservoirs, too, are burning. The pall of smoke over these dramatic scenes climbed almost as high as the telltale clouds which the RAF left behind them at Cologne. There's a grim satisfaction in denying the use of assets which one must leave behind to a treacherous enemy. Would that we'd performed the scorched earth policy in Malaya. But let us be realistic too. Someday, reconquering Burma, we shall recover our damaged assets. Therefore, scorched earth is only a second best policy. In the future, we must be strong enough and resolute enough to throw back any aggressor and preserve our empire from the ravages of war.
The Japanese continued their relentless march towards Mandalay and beyond.
Well, of course, I think anybody who's fought them will realize they're absolutely first-class soldiers. They were courageous to have fought. And to die for the emperor was something to be striven for. I mean, so far as we're concerned, the last thing we ought to do is to die for our king and country, if we could avoid it. They just fought on and fought on. I mean, there's occasions where practically a whole unit was wiped out, except for a dozen people. Now, you'd have thought that had been a good chance for them to break off and get away. Well, they did that, but instead of just making their way quietly away, they launched another attack on a British unit and died to a man. They're quite remarkable people, really.
Britain's weary troops, aided by the Chinese, continued to be outmaneuvered and outgunned throughout Burma.
Japanese kept on, so to speak, leapfrogging down the coast, and that was why they were so successful. And of course, they were well equipped with 200 tanks, and we had none. And they were also sensible enough to have collected a fleet of bicycles, which enabled them to travel fast and to outflank our troops.
The battle to regain Burma was well and truly lost by Britain's forgotten army as it finally retreated to India.
When the army finally emerged out of Burma and onto the Indian frontier, it was in a very shattered condition. But it was still a coherent military force carrying its weapons. In fact, its reception by the rest of the army in India was little short of scandalous. And rather than being welcomed as a force that had fought its way out of Burma against overwhelming odds, it was tended to be looked down upon, and basic facilities such as hospital treatment and rest and recuperation simply weren't there. Troops were just shown a hillside and told to make camp.
With the Japanese poised ready for attack from Burma, with German armies smashing their way through to the Caucasus, and with the threat of violent non-violence from Gandhi and Congress, the defense of India had become one of the most urgent duties among all the urgent duties of Britain and the United Nations.
By the end of 1942, Britain's fear was that the Japanese forces would surge over the Burmese borders into India. This meant that every resource that could be mustered in men and material had to be pulled together.
With the troops came much equipment, well-trained fighting manpower and their armored fighting vehicles for the defense of India and, when the time comes, to take part in the Allied counter-offensive against Japan.
India was of crucial importance to the British Empire. It looked two ways, both to Africa and the Middle East, where there was fighting occurring, but also to the Far East. It was an industrial base, a great source of manpower. The Indian Army had been expanded from 200,000 men in 1939 to over 1 million in 1942, and ultimately reached 2.5 million men. That was the moment the Indian Congress asked Britain to leave India.
Well, in those days, of course, it was the last days of the Raj, the British influence over India, which had lasted since the 17th century. And there's a great deal of civil unrest, I'm afraid, fulminated by Gandhi. You can't really blame Gandhi for that. But it did come at the most inconvenient time because it was in the middle of the war. So we were beleaguered a bit by having these civil disobedience.
Fortunately, Indian industrial production wasn't badly affected, and it continued to supply armaments for the British Army in the Burma theatre.
With a population of nearly 400 million, there is an unlimited source of willing manpower and womanpower for the work. India's steel production has been forging ahead. 2 million tons of pig iron, 1,200,000 tons of steel a year, these figures are on the increase. So India is contributing not only her fighting men, but also the equipment for their campaigns.
In these steel works are to be seen the first steps in the production of armored cars, forged out of Indian steel, the handiwork of Indian workmen, made, produced, assembled in India. This is the beginning of India defending itself. Now comes the cutting of the armored plate into sections. A dance routine on a sliding floor. A dash of Fred Astaire without Ginger Rogers. Marked, cut, the armored plates go to be assembled. Part by part, they are put together. The workmanship, the craftsmanship is entirely Indian. We too have awakened to the need of the hour.
In December 1942, the strengthened British forces, using the 14th Infantry Division, went on the offensive in the 1st Arakan.
News from the Burma front, where the British advance into the division of Arakan countered the immediate threat to Chittagong and the rest of Bengal. Full use has been made of the many waterways in this part of Burma, and craft of many different types have been pressed into service, bringing up troops and supplies. Here on the Mayu Peninsula, a difficult campaign has been in progress against first-class Japanese troops, many of them veterans of the fighting in China and Malaya. A difficult campaign in difficult country, whether from the point of view of battle or communications.
The Arakan was an attractive place to fight, and it was the shortest route back to Rangoon. But the first Arakan was a severe disappointment, and it showed that the Japanese were still the masters of jungle fighting. Simultaneously, in February 1943, a new British force was infiltrated behind the Japanese lines.
Named after the lion-like figures guarding Burmese temples, the Chindits in this case consisted of a specially trained force of British, Gurkhas and Burmese who've just done an amazing job in Burma. Their leader describes them as a long-range penetration group. Entirely independent, with mules for transport and silver rupees for pay, they relied on the support of the RAF only for supplies. Penetrating over 300 miles into Japanese-occupied Burma, crossing the Chindwin and the Irrawaddy, they cut the Meiktila railway in 80 different places and proved that a large force can fight in the jungle without communications. They drew off a Japanese division from the Chinese. They also brought hope to loyal Burmese in the same way that their leader rallied the Abyssinian patriots in 1941. Leaflets were printed in the jungle, a prince of one of the Shan states broadcast from the jungle. The force withdrew after 3 months of brilliant success under the command of Brigadier Wingate.
Major General Wingate was a very controversial figure. He was a man of great charm and charisma, and his men loved him. So did we, because when he spoke to you, you had a tremendous, he gave you a tremendous feeling of confidence, and you felt that he was going to get you the victory.
Dropping supplies to the Chindits, yes. The column I was most concerned with was Major Ferguson's. We dropped an awful lot of stuff to him. On one occasion I noticed he sent a radio message back to base that he'd lost his monocle. Could we get him another one? And we duly got another one, I think from Dum Dum or Calcutta, and dropped it to him in a sack of rice. He found it all right. About February 43, if I remember correctly, they went out. We dropped anything they wanted, anything they asked for, if humanly possible, we dropped it. And it was all down to people like Bill Burberry. He used to say to us, and to any replacements we got, he used to say, the people at the sharp end of this are the people on the ground, the 14th Army or the Chindit, he said. They rely on us for their food, arms, ammunition, medical supplies. And he said, we must not let them down, ever. I think it's true to say we never ever did. If it's humanly possible to fly at all, we get up, we get out. I mean, we did lose some aircraft due to bad weather when in theory we shouldn't have taken off. And sometimes we take off in good weather and find over the dropping zone it's hopeless. So we'd have to come back. It's a pity, but the average run over the dropping zone would be about 20 minutes. Clear the load in about 8 runs over the target. Freeload stuff, we come in at treetop height, things like sacks of rice, they'd be wrapped up in about 3 different sacks. Anything like arms ammunition which need a parachute, the height would go in would be 600 feet. So it was, I mean, if you had a mixed load, you get rid of the freeload stuff first and go at 600 feet and then finish your drop. I used to either stand by the door and push the stuff out or lean back and kick the stuff out. I never met Slim, I met Wingate.
His first operation, although it was very costly indeed, was that it showed that we could operate in the jungle just as effectively as the Japanese. And so its morale value was very good indeed.
Now, the importance of the first Chindit operation was not that it achieved very much, but that it put British and Gurkha troops miles behind the Japanese front line, supplied them, allowed them to carry out offensive operations, and get back. Now, that was a tremendous morale victory, because it showed that properly led and properly equipped British and Gurkha troops could overcome all the problems of fighting in the jungle and still attack the Japanese on their own ground.
In the early days at Lahore, when we got the first DC-2s, there were no tools with it. And of course, the English, British standard size didn't fit the American aircraft. There were Pratt & Whitney Wasp engines or Wright Cyclones, if I remember. No tools, no handbook. So we were shunted along to United States base near us, and I was told that there was a master sergeant, I think it was, who would tell us all about the engines and that, and put us on the right road. So I was shunted into a tent there, and I said, well, where is he? He said, well, that's him there, lying underneath a table, blind drunk. So I said, well, no, not much good. Is anybody else? I said, oh, nobody else. A lot of good, isn't it? Anyway, when I was in their camp, I noticed on the left-hand side here was a whacking great toolbox, handler, proper things. I thought, well, that's for me. And I went this side and nicked the toolbox and took it round the back and hit it. And in the meantime, one of the officers with us appropriated a jeep. So we got in the jeep, went back in the jeep, and me with the toolbox, the officer with the jeep. And I'm sure they never missed either. They had so much stuff there that they could have run a war on their own from there. But anyway, that's how I got my first tools. I pinched them. The terrible state of affairs, but like the Army, Forgotten Army, we were the Forgotten Air Force. We were short of everything.
War report from Burma, where after a fresh Japanese attack, our troops have been grimly holding on to their new positions on the Arakan front. Blenheim crews are briefed before hitting back. The Blenheims are bombed up with 250-pounders for an attack on enemy entrenchments. War on the Arakan front is on a comparatively small scale at present, and it may not assume bigger proportions till after the monsoon, but it's of very great importance just the same. While the troops hold on to their recaptured slice of Burma, the Royal Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force harass the Japanese from the air, giving them a foretaste of things to come. Though only a small part of Burma has yet been freed, many villages have already returned more or less to normal. Life goes on, and Burma police return to duty. General Sir Alan Hartley, Wavell's deputy here, inspects a forward area. Not far ahead, his troops are entrenched within a few hundred yards of the enemy lines, and they're in good spirits in spite of cigarettes being in short supply. It's a war of jungle fighting, of ambush and sniping against an enemy who's proved himself a master of the art. A war of patrol activity in which the Bren carrier scouts along the coast. The mule is often used in country where the Bren carrier can't go. Indian troops in the forefront of the fighting are reported to have done extremely well. They and their comrades from the United Kingdom have learnt a lot since Japan entered on her career of conquest. Presently, they'll be teaching the Japs.
And already Allied air power, so sadly lacking in earlier campaigns in the Far East, is making itself felt. Enemy bombers work hard to help the Japanese to recover lost ground in Burma, but our Hurricanes are on the job too, shooting down the bombers and strafing enemy positions. The campaign is not yet an offensive, but it is an advance and a beginning, and attack in Burma is a big threat to the whole Japanese position.
Part of the Arakan plan was to capture Akyab Island off the Burma coast and use its airfields as a stepping stone back to Burma. But the British assaults in the Arakan made slow progress, as they were still outfought by the Japanese. On May the 14th, 1943, Mung Daw was retaken by the Japanese, and the British were pushed back again to India.
As the fighting developed in the Far East, it became clear that it was going to be primarily an American theatre, but that Burma and the China Road and the Chinese in southern China, who were also operating Burma, were all going to need coordinating very badly. So therefore, a joint commander who was going to be acceptable not only to the Americans, but also to the Chinese and British, had to be found. Now, Churchill selected for that Admiral Louis Mountbatten. The Americans liked him and were prepared to support him, and he was also an extremely good man manager.
I don't think he was much of a soldier, and I heard somebody say pranged a few ships. I don't know whether that's true.
There's a little story that goes about, and I'm sure Lord Louis wouldn't mind me saying this now, but he was always in a hurry to get back into Newcastle, and he used to take the Kelly up. And any of the old veterans from the Kelly will tell you this. He used to take the Kelly up the time at a rare speed to get alongside because he wanted to get home to his wife. And he used to take the ship's side along. And there was always a side party out repainting the ship the following day. I don't think that says an awful lot for his seamanship abilities, but I wouldn't like to. I wouldn't like to hold that against him because he was a great leader.
In Mina, near Cairo, Egypt, Roosevelt, Churchill and Chiang Kai-shek met with their chiefs of staff to plan the offensive storm which was to engulf Japan in a hurricane of retribution. The end was not in sight, but it was certain.
By October 1943, with the British forces regrouping at Imphal and Kohima, Major General William Slim was appointed to lead the 14th Army.
He again was a wonderfully charismatic fellow and a tremendous leader of men and a brilliant soldier. He was a wonderful choice. He was previously in Iraq, of course, commissioned into the 6th Gurkha Rifles, and so he knew a lot about the Indian Army and what we could do and what we couldn't do.
The Gurkhas were known for their courage and loyalty to the British.
The word Gurkha originates from a small town in western Nepal called Gurkha. Gurkhas formed a very key element of General Slim's 14th Army. Gurkhas come from the independent country of Nepal, which has never been part of the British Empire, and therefore the Gurkhas themselves are extremely independent of nature, are very proud and very hardy because they come from a very hard environment. Gurkhas' reputation always went before them. Their long curved knife to kukri, their determination to close with the enemy, their preference for fighting hand to hand rather than from somewhere away, it made them a very feared enemy. And it was the sort of soldier who was very capable of taking on the Japanese at his own game and beating him.
The Gurkhas, I better speak about them because they're my special friends, you see. They were really specially equipped for this privation because in their home country they had to live very similarly to that. So what to us was immense hardship was to them fairly easy going, except at the end, of course, when they didn't have food and we were all starving, which was a different matter. we didn't deserve the admiration which they held us and the respect. A little Gurkha would come up to you and say, I'd give my life for you, Saab. And you know he was not shooting a line, he was telling the truth. And when somebody says that to you, you know you're rather bowled over. In the rifle company, the setup was that you had, each of the platoon commanders was a Jemadar. It was a senior Indian officer. And there was a company Subadar, and he was rather like an old hen when he was rushing around making sure you were looked after, and you know they treated you as little demigods, I think, you know, and you felt totally inadequate really to repay that sort of trust and affection. Wonderfully courageous, you know. I mean, their motto is it's better to die than to be a coward, and they live that motto out.
To carry supplies and troops, the Japanese built the Burma-Thailand Railway, which was over 1,200 miles long. 62,000 prisoners of war and 200,000 native labourers were used to construct it.
From Moulmein in Burma to Bangkok in Siam, they built the Railway of Death.
We were then transshipped up to Moulmein. We were put in a train and taken a few miles to where the train stopped going south. And they said, now this is where the railway starts. And we had to start building the railway.
The railway, as you know, was built in stages. There were so many camps, something like 100 or so camps, the whole way up the railway, of which you had to work backwards and forwards along a given line to join up with other camps coming towards you and from you.
For 300 miles, the railway was driven straight across country, through jungle, through rock, and over rivers. Those who built it worked over 18 hours a day, mostly with their bare hands, with less than the minimum of food, and without medical aid.
At that time, malaria was hitting very hard, and of course there were no drugs to deal with it.
11,000 Allied POWs, nearly half the total, perished. Their rough graves line the route. All were driven like slaves to work. They were beaten if they even paused.
The worst people in the Japanese army were the engineers that were working on the railway. They were dreadful, absolutely dreadful. And of course, this happened for 2.5 years, 2 years I spent up on that railway. I went from one end into Burma and worked on the Burma end until the railway was finished there, and then had to be brought back by truck.
Some were beaten to death. Every single one was systematically starved and ill-treated.
For instance, if you were going out to the toilet of a night time, and most of us had some kind of dysentery at this time, and the guard would stand outside the hut in the dark, and you probably wouldn't see him. And there would be a kura, and you stand to attention, and this guard would come round and say, "Nanda, why not salute?" And then he would just start to beat you up. Now, if there was no other Japanese or Korean in the area, it would just mean a couple of smacks around the head, usually with the cupped hand, and made your ear sing, I can tell you, and off you go. If there were other Japanese in the area, we come now to this thing of losing face. And he would continue to beat this man up and kick him on the ground until he was unconscious. And that thing happened umpteen times a day. It was a dreadful life.
All this happened a long way away from us here at home, but it did happen. Let no one forget it. This generation and the next must know and remember what kind of a people the Japanese are.
I think perhaps the worst thing of being about a prisoner of war was the fact that you never knew when your last moment was coming. You could collect cholera and be dead within 24 hours, or you could be beaten to death by the Japanese.
Whilst the first Chindit operation was a comparatively modest affair, the second one was planned on a much bigger scale. And the plan this time was not to withdraw troops from behind Japanese lines, but to leave them there. So troops were going to be put in really large quantities by glider. And then they were going to set up strongholds, strong enough to resist all the attempts of the Japanese to take those strongholds. And then they were going to sally out of those strongholds and attack Japanese targets on the Japanese line of communication.
The operation started on the 5th of March 1944, and it's interesting to note it was exactly 3 months and 1 day before the biggest combined operation of all time, which was D-Day, the Operation Overlord, the landing on the coast of Normandy. We flew from a little airstrip called Lalagat in Assam, going about 250 miles over the Chindwin to land in a little jungle clearing in the heart of Burma.
With the British forces poised on the Burmese borders, the Chindit's second infiltration operation behind Japanese lines was scheduled to start, again under their extraordinary leader, General Ord Wingate.
Unfortunately, he had the unhappy knack of rubbing up the wrong way all the senior people above him, and it was only because of his contact with Churchill in the previous August that he had this power of getting all these tremendous resources employed to his own benefit. And when you think, as I've said previously, that we're only just three months away from D-Day, it was really an amazing thing to get the support of the American Air Force as we had done, and all those resources applied to our use.
Wingate was a controversial figure. He was certainly inspirational. He had a strong messianic quality. His parents had been Plymouth Brethren. He had served in Palestine and became a convinced Zionist. In East Africa, against Italians, he had led a force which he dubbed Gideon Force. This is all very biblical, and this summed up his character.
And we were standing alongside our gliders, and we noticed that quite a high-level conference was taking place just about 50 yards from us, as General Wingate and the Chief of the United States Air Commando, Colonel Cochrane, a last-minute operation, reconnaissance by Colonel Rushton of the USA Air Force, had made a check over the place we were due to land and had found the landing strip was covered with huge trunks of teak.
Because of the terrain, the Chindits were totally reliant on their mules behind enemy lines.
Oh, the mules were wonderful. I mean, I can't speak too highly of the mules because they were the unsung heroes of the campaign. They were really wonderful creatures, so sure-footed, and you'd see them there with their guts shot out and dying and just champing away at the grass, you know, really wonderful creatures they were. We've never done anything without them. You see, they carried all our Vickers machine guns, the medium machine guns, the 3-inch mortars and the ammunition for the 3-inch mortars, and the most important load of the lot, of course, was the wireless set, with which we could communicate with base. Well, the whole purpose of cutting the vocal cords was to prevent the enormous noise they made in braying, you see. I mean, you could hear them for hundreds of yards in the jungle. I don't think that worried them. I mean, it might sound horrific to us now, but I don't think it troubled them very much. They didn't seem to worry about it anyhow. Without the aid of the Americans, of course, we could have done nothing at all, because they helped us in two very special ways, or three very special ways. First of all, the first US Air Commando flew the gliders and the Dakotas to take us into Burma. Thereafter, their Dakotas supplied us by air with ammunition, food and clothing, whatever we needed.
But on the 5th of March, it was still touch and go as to whether Operation Thursday would happen at all.
We didn't know whether the security operation had been blown entirely, and perhaps the Japanese were waiting for us. But they decided to go ahead in any case, and it took off. The first flight took off just after 6 p.m. on Sunday, the 5th of March, 1944, and landed behind the Japanese lines with a view to cutting the communication between the Japs in the north of the province, who were facing the Chinese in the Yukon Valley, and denying them supplies which were coming from Rangoon. To our alarm, the glider on our starboard side kept swinging in towards us, obviously not under very good control. So our pilot hit the switch releasing the tow, and we banked and came down and landed not so very far away, only a few miles away from the airstrip. Wingate received a signal from the strip, which was called Broadway in central Burma. It said Soya Link, which meant that they were having difficulties. If it had been successful, it would have been pork sausage. So when he got this message, all the landings for that night were cut off. But amazingly, the gliders who got through managed, in the space of the hours between that time and the following evening, to hack out of the rough terrain a suitable landing strip. The next night, we managed to land on it by Dakota. The RAF, of course, after the initial stage, they took their own share of the supply dropping, and also in Broadway, they took turns with the American in providing a fighter cover. On the first operation, they noticed some wide open spaces in the jungle, clearings, which they thought might be useful for landing strips, because even then Wingate had in mind the idea of a bigger operation the following year. And so these places came into being: Broadway, Piccadilly, Chowringhee, and so on. And Aberdeen, that's another one. It was the Piccadilly one which was blocked with logs, as I mentioned earlier.
There was even a method of picking up gliders without the Dakotas having to land. It was called the snatch. This meant that gliders could be retrieved from limited clearings.
We went across the other side of the clearing in the jungle and selected a spot where we'd make our own defensive position, because at that time it was intended we would operate as garrison troops in this clearing in the jungle, which was defined as a stronghold. We ended up by having a very effective defensive position. And thirdly, there was a light plane force comprised of L-1s and L-5 aircraft, and they were a very courageous bunch, because they flew in on almost impossible landing strips and took out the wounded. In the previous operation, if you received a wound and you couldn't walk, then you were just left to your own devices. You're left in the jungle with a bottle of water, a grenade and a rifle, and many of them just died or just expedited their end by committing suicide.
All the concentration was of this country building up for D-Day, which is fair enough, I suppose, and we had to make do and mend. For instance, if we had something wrong with an engine, I had to scrounge a bit from another engine, do things like that. But if an American had something with an engine, he'd just change the engine, because they had all the stuff they had there, and it was amazing. Having said that, they were great help to us as well in supply dropping. They had more aircraft available than we had, and they did a good job.
The Chindits set up defended perimeters, blocking railway lines and defending airstrips so that the supplies could be brought to them. Their operations in the rear of Mitaguchi's armies, fighting at Imphal and Kohima, were important because they diverted Japanese resources and effort away from the planned assault on India. The Chindits also provided support for General Stilwell's operations against Michener in northeast Burma. Meanwhile, the British were ready to repel the Japanese in the Second Arakan.
The Second Arakan attack was much better planned. General Slim was in charge of this. In fact, the orders he was given was to plan for a land attack in conjunction with an amphibious attack down the coast and an airborne attack. But General Slim was always a great realist, and looking at the requirements for the invasion of Germany in Europe, he felt quite rightly that the chances of getting landing craft for this sort of operation were pretty remote. So he planned basically for a land assault. And this time he intended to get it absolutely right. He knew that the Japanese always worked to very fine logistic and administrative barriers, and so therefore he determined that he would play on that to defeat them. In the fighting in the Arakan, the Japanese resisted the British advance furiously. But this time the British were not disconcerted when the Japanese cut them off. And the key battle was the Battle of the Administrative Box. It doesn't sound a particularly exciting battle, but in fact the Administrative Box was where all the vulnerable parts of the invasion force were, all its supplies, hospitals, casualty clearing stations, reserves, headquarters. It was essential that the Japanese could break into this and destroy it. But in fact, in the end, they virtually destroyed themselves trying to break into the administrative box. And the more troops they devoted to it, the more they became ensnared in an impossible task. The longer time it took, the less their fine administrative margins could cope, until eventually the British then went on to the offensive. And using carefully put together groups of armour, fighter ground attack, infantry and artillery, they broke in onto the Japanese strong points and took them one by one. The Japanese, bereft of supplies, fighting furiously all the way, slowly disintegrated. And for the first time, the British inflicted a major defeat upon the Japanese in the jungle.
The Chindits, still behind Japanese lines, got the terrible news that their leader, Wingate, had been killed.
The great tragedy, the greatest tragedy of the Chindit operation was that he was killed about 3 weeks into the operation. He came to us in his Mitchell bomber, and he went back to Imphal, and against all advice, the weather was atrocious, against all advice he decided he wanted to go back to his own headquarters. And during the flight from Imphal, they crashed into a mountain, I'm afraid. That was the end of it.
These are the first newsreel pictures of this great little soldier, the man who trained British troops to live in the jungle and beat the Japanese at their own kind of fighting. No detail was too trivial for the inspection of General Wingate. He knew that in war, trivial details cost lives. The kit of a man who will live and fight for months cut off in the jungle is an all-important factor. General Wingate knew how vital it is to carry the things you need and how vital to leave behind the things you don't.
After that, I think we were really sunk. I mean, we were grief-stricken when we heard it, of course.
This brilliant officer has lost his life in a plane crash, all too soon in a campaign that is crammed with hazards. We mourn his loss, but we know that his teaching will bear fruit in due course. These are the men of the long-range penetration group. Their fighting behind the enemy lines in Burma has made them a name throughout the world. That is the epitaph for Charles Ord Wingate.
The commander of 111 Brigade, who was Joe Lentane, was then promoted to command the division, whereas, of course, by far the best leader would have been Michael Calvert. And we can't blame Lentane for not having the contacts which Wingate had. He had contacts right up to Churchill, of course. We can't blame him for that, but he didn't have the same pull with Vinegar Joe Stillwell, the American general, who was in overall charge of the operation.
Stillwell had a clandestine force of his own. The name Merrill's Marauders was coined by an American war correspondent for a 3,000-strong force of American volunteers under Brigadier General Frank Merrill. Their code name was Galahad, and their purpose was to operate in much the same way as the British Chindits behind the enemy lines.
In May 1944, under General Stillwell's operational control, they captured the Japanese airfield at Meiktila. This was a significant achievement and went some way to helping Stillwell realise his ambition to open the Lido Road, an alternative supply route from Burma into China to replace the Burma Road. While in command of his Marauders, Merrill suffered 2 heart attacks, and day-to-day control of his troops therefore fell upon his subordinate, Colonel Charles Hunter. Merrill's Marauders, in common with the Chindits, were a lightly armed force who relied heavily upon air support. Airdrops by parachute, or Dakotas landing on prepared airstrips. They were also dependent on the light L-5 aircraft to evacuate casualties. Casualty evacuation was very important because men could never be left behind to the tender mercies of the Japanese, who would torture prisoners. However, they were not equipped to carry on fighting in the field for any length of time, and the fact that General Stillwell insisted that they did remain in the field entailed heavy losses. The original complement of Merrill's Marauders, 3,000 strong and 3 battalions, was diluted by men being drafted in, and their fighting quality was therefore diminished. It was only at the end of October 1944 that Meiktila town itself fell to Stillwell's forces.
By this time, they'd suffered severely from the exertions of campaigning in the jungle on half rations and fighting against a tenacious enemy like the Japanese. Stillwell reinforced them, but by this time they had practically ceased to exist as a fighting force. When Meiktila town fell in August 1944, the survivors had already been withdrawn, and as with the Chindits, Stillwell kept Merrill's Marauders in the field for too long. They were forced to operate as conventional infantry, and just like the Chindits, they were worn down by unremitting combat. The Marauders had fought in 5 major and 30 minor actions. The survivors were sent to the 457th Infantry Regiment. Sadly, none of their special force operations succeeded in diverting the Japanese from their key objective, Imphal, followed by the invasion of India. In March 1944, General Motoguchi launched his offensive against Imphal. To a certain extent, he caught General Slim by surprise. Some formations were surrounded and had to fight their way out, but in the main, the British held their ground as they had in the Second Arakan battle. They were supplied by air. Indeed, whole formations were brought in to relieve the troops. Mountbatten secured American aircraft to bring the 5th Division from the Arakan to Imphal, and artillery regiments that were fighting on Monday in the Arakan several hundred miles away were at Imphal just 3 days later.
The first few weeks, you see, we were in the dry season, but then it became rain in about June or early July, and that then was atrocious. There was no never-ending rain. You were up to your knees in mud all the time, plastered with mud and wet through. You never once dry. In fact, I used to go into the river and wash my clothes and just put them on wet. My clothes were wet and clean rather than wet and plastered with mud.
The Chindits. Masters in guerrilla warfare, they've taught the Japanese to fear the swift striking columns of elusive fighting men who wage war after their own fashion deep in the Burma jungle. Chinese units under General Stilwell move up to join forces with the Chindits.
The archives seem to imply that the Chinese did a great deal, but I don't think they did really. I think they're really more concerned with what was going on in their own country. See, don't forget the Japanese invaded them in 1937, and they've been fighting with the Japanese all these years. And the Burma Road to get supplies to them was really not to help us in our campaign in Burma, but to help the Chinese in their war with Japan in their own country.
After bitter fighting, the Chinese drove the Japs out of Magong railway station and joined the Chindits. This was a great moment in the history of the Burma War and was celebrated by swapping hats.
The Chinese were General Stilwell's pet force, of course, and I remember on one occasion we were told we were likely to meet Chinese, and by this time we had little maps of Burma on orange silk, and we were told that if we waved that silk map at the Chinese, they'd recognize us as friends. Well, one of our little patrols, only a section patrol, about 10 men went out, and they saw the Chinese coming towards them and waved their little maps, and they're met by a burst of fire. Very unfriendly approach. And so they returned fire with much greater effect than the Chinese. The Chinese had wounded a couple of our men. I think we killed about 4 of them before beating it.
Air support for the final drive against the Jap positions. Outmaneuvered and outfought, the Japs pulled out of the town. Magong had fallen.
A daring and very gallant attack on Magong, in which the 6 Gurkhas gained 2 Victoria Crosses, broke into Magong and destroyed the railway track. This stopped the Japanese getting supplies to their forward armies and was a tremendous blow to them.
Chindits, that's the name for the guardian statues which stand at the steps of Burmese pagodas, a name from legend that's become flesh and blood, living guardians of Burma's liberty.
Stilwell was a charismatic leader, and the Chinese were prepared to follow him almost anywhere. But unfortunately, he found it very difficult to work with the British. He had a deep, ingrained suspicion of what the British were actually up to, and he suspected that the British were using the Americans to regain their colonial empire, which the Japanese had taken away from them.
We have very unkind thoughts about Stilwell, I'm afraid. He had a great hatred of the British. I don't know why. He hated anything to do with the limeys, he called us. And anything to do us down, gave him great pleasure. A very great mistake was to close down the White City near Morloo, where Brigadier Calvert had opened up. He had this throttle hold on the road and rail, and the Japanese kept attacking ineffectually, and they reckoned that they always had about upwards of 1,000 Japanese bodies hanging in the wire, so it was rather a smelly place. And in fact, the light plane force said they used to navigate by smell. Well, he had the thing sewn up properly. Not only did he have this blockage on the railway, but he had quite a strong force of about 3 battalions, which he used as a floater force, and they could stand off from the block and attack the Japanese as they attacked the block. Well, for some reason, I don't know why, they decided that place had to be closed down, and another one opened up further up the railway, and this was called Blackpool. And so eventually we were moved out of Broadway and sent to help the defence of Blackpool. We found to our horror that things were not going at all well. The force which we'd been promised to act as a floater company never came into being, and we were left there to fend for ourselves. By this time, the Japanese had got the measure of us, and they invested us not only with their own normal forces, but with anti-aircraft batteries as well. So it became virtually impossible for the position to be supplied by air. And we came to a situation eventually where we had virtually no ammunition. We hadn't had food for about 5 days. And there's a choice either to stay there and fight to the last man and be decimated, or to make a break for it and come back and hopefully fight again another day. And that's what the brigade commander eventually decided to do. And so we broke away from Blackpool, where we'd suffered very heavy casualties indeed, and made our way back up into the hills again. We had some wounded men there who couldn't make it, they wouldn't go very far. And about 18 of them we had to shoot, I'm afraid, shoot our own wounded. The Japanese would have found them. They would not just have let them die or offered any assistance. They'd have butchered them in the most inhumane manner they could conceive. I think they'd probably have bayoneted them, done something like that, so they died as slowly as ever possible, because they were totally inhuman, I'm afraid. They were stopped at Kohima. I think we can claim partly, at least, as a result of our efforts. And they didn't get beyond that.
If the Japanese had succeeded in taking Kohima, then they could quite easily have advanced further to the main supply base of Dimapur. And had they taken Dimapur, which was very lightly defended, that would have been a disaster, because this was the main rail, road and river communication axis for all British forces fighting in Imphal and Kohima, and that would have been a disaster. We have to remember that the battles for Kohima and Imphal went on from March to July at a massive intensity, with the battle seesawing sometimes in the Japanese favour and sometimes in the British favour. It was incredibly intense fighting, and it was touch and go the whole time. The Japanese were on the point of breaking through several times, and the British on occasions only just held them. But the longer it took, the more it became into Britain's favour. The more she was able to reinforce, the less the Japanese were able to reinforce, and slowly the Japanese were worn down in this ding-dong battle. So once they had moved away from Imphal and Kohima and started to withdraw, although they held the British up and fought them furiously on several points on the way back, they were never the same formidable force again.
And that, I think, was the start of the Japanese collapse. Prior to all this, the Japanese were regarded as supermen who could do virtually anything. But this turned the tables.
However, was obtained.
The Royal Navy had been virtually absent from the Far East since Force Z at the start of the conflict began to re-enter the Pacific and Asian theatre.
It would possibly tie in with the push back from Kohima, and the second, when the advance into Burma took place. I qualified for the Burma Star by virtue of being in and around the East Indies at the time with the East Indies fleet. I did a little bit in the fleet arm towards the end of the war. I did a little bit as a telegraphist air gunner, as a tag they call them. And you're an air gunner and you just sit tight really. You put your faith in the skipper. And in the aircraft I'm talking about, the Avenger, there was 3 of you. And you just had to put your faith into him. He was the one sitting in charge, and you were facing the sea and he was looking down at the flight deck, and you just hoped that the hook would catch one of the first 3 wires. If you missed the first 3 wires, you were in trouble because the aircraft would crash into a barrier. You just sit and hope, really. But in those days, of course, we flew Barracudas, Avengers, and the fighters, of course, were the Corsair, Hellcat, lovely fighter, brilliant aircraft. Seafire's a brilliant version. Of course, it was the Fleet Air Arm version of the Spitfire, but the one problem with the Seafire was its landing speed. It was just a bit too fast, and we used to lose a little bit. In my particular ship, they used the Seafire as a combat air patrol, CAP we used to call it. But it was a very useful aircraft, but I really, really think that it was never built to be used by aircraft carriers. The Barracuda was called Bits and Pieces. She was a dreadful aircraft in my view, but I might be sued by the Ministry of Defence or somebody of that nature. But it really was. It really didn't do its job. It was classified as a dive bomber, but I never dived in it or anything like that. I wouldn't be very keen on flying too much in the Barracuda. It was hated by everybody, I think.
Over to Burma, where units of the 14th Army have recently scored notable successes on the Arakan sector. Though the campaign in Burma has provided setbacks and disappointments, here's a story of victory. They're packing and dispatching supplies of all kinds to be dropped by parachute for the 7th Indian Division. Men of this division had been cut off by Japanese forces during a battle which lasted 20 days, but they never lacked supplies. Large transports and Stinsons not only delivered the goods, they also did terrific work evacuating wounded. Certainly the war in Burma calls for maximum skill, both in planning and fighting. And the full strength of Britain and America will have to be brought to bear before Japan's collapse can be achieved. Here, the 7th Indian Division cut their way out and disposed of nearly 5,000 Japs in the process.
During the second Arakan, the RAF in Burma received a number of Bristol Beaufighters, which were fast with a top speed of 300 miles an hour. The Blenheims only had a top speed of 266. More important was the Beaufighters' range of 1,500 miles. They attacked the Japanese-held airfield at Rangoon and bombed and strafed targets as far afield as Bangkok.
Also from the Arakan front, a story of Japanese being encircled. These are some of the prisoners taken during our victorious clash with the crack Japanese 55th Division. All the same, British and Indian, American and Chinese troops have taken the measure of the enemy here in Burma. In spite of appalling conditions in this jungle campaign, they'll persevere with this very hard battle till the enemy are beaten throughout Burma
as they were recently beaten in Arakan.
On the 11th of July 1944, the Japanese General Kawabe ordered the suspension of the Imphal operation because of the failure of the Japanese supply system, the successful second Chindit operation, and the continual British air attacks.
Though the Arakan may soon be obsolete, its war record has been magnificent. The RAF is still using this great fighter in the Far East. Our picture shows Harry bombers setting out to destroy a group of 50 or 60 Japs in a nearby village. Some of them were craftily and unscrupulously concealed in a temple. Tracks leading to the village were bombed, but great accuracy in pinpointing the temple was needed. 12 500-pounders were dropped, and every one of them found its mark.
A good deal of my time was spent shunting other people around, moving 5 squadron ground staff from one base to another. They had Hurricanes by then, if I remember correctly. And we moved 17 squadron around, moving a few VIPs around, and in between that supply dropping to 14th Army, moving south.
Although the British 14th Army, fighting in Burma, has been engaged in the heaviest land fighting against the Japs, whom it's steadily driving back, those troops of ours are sometimes called the Forgotten Army. However that may be, these pictures from Arakan certainly stress the appallingly tough conditions under which the 14th fights.
In June, the monsoon struck.
Supply problems are harder than have been encountered before in any campaign. The hot, steaming climate is physically exhausting enough, quite apart from all the extra reserves of energy which fighting demands. In a country of mountain and jungle and malaria, these British troops are enduring and overcoming hardships and hazards far beyond anything we can imagine here in Britain. For them, shelter at night means this. Every case of supplies has to be hauled up the mountainside by hand.
Wingate's plan had been that we should stay in Burma for about 2 months only, but Stilwell kept us in there fighting, and we were kept there for 5 months and sort of beaten down to our knees physically.
As for the rain, well, Arakan gets about 8 times as much rain as Britain, almost all of it between June and October. But the 14th has fought right through the rains. It has driven back the Japs and continues to do so in spite of every difficulty and every hardship. No, the 14th Army, winning victories in Burma, is not forgotten.
I didn't get malaria or dysentery. I was very fortunate then, I suppose. But towards the end of the campaign, I noticed that some of the British troops were dying. They hadn't been wounded, they weren't sick. And so I spoke to our senior medical officer, Doc White, and he said, well, they've come to the end of their tether. They've had so much, they can't take any more, and well, there's no point in carrying on. They just turned their face to the wall and died.
Deep in the Chin Hills of northern Burma, British, Chinese, and American troops are fighting to reopen the supply routes to China. They are fighting the Japanese, but also disease, hot days and frozen nights, and through a long period of each year, the flooding rain. Side by side, the machinery of the West and the labor of the East. The road was cut from the mountains, and with the rain, the mountains piled back onto the roads.
So heavy had been Japanese losses that unexpectedly they didn't attempt to hold the next natural barrier, which was the line of the Chindit River. In fact, they kept withdrawing right the way back towards the Irrawaddy. This was the first time that the British Army had fought right through the terrible downpours of the monsoon season. But Slim realized that he could not afford to give the Japs any respite, so fighting went on continuously right through the monsoon.
The respite the Japanese armies had expected was not granted. Under constant air and ground pressure, the enemy was thrown back from Imphal and Kohima. The enemy has been taught some new tricks in jungle fighting by the 14th. Ammunition dumps were left behind as the Nipponese fell back. The rising sun has begun to set throughout the Far East. Supreme Commander Mountbatten inspects his units in the Manipur sector. Battered enemy tanks dot this territory, just wrested from the Japanese. Hurricane fighter bombers sweep in to attack a jungle village. These versatile craft have not only helped remove the Jap to India, they are now hastening the liberation of Burma and the entire East Asia sector.
During the battles at Imphal and Kohima, Allied casualties were 16,700 against over 30,000 for the Japanese. Across country, 5,100 Chindits died, and the RAF lost 130 aircraft. As the main British forces made their way south towards Tiddim, supplying the troops became more of a problem.
Sometimes the problem is solved by air transport, but this isn't always possible. A case in point is covered by these pictures of river transport up among the Lushai Hills on the border of Assam. Supplies for troops and their mules has all got to be taken upriver in these boats. An arduous journey of 180 miles, which takes anything from 15 to 20 days. Flour, sugar, rice and fodder, those are the main items, but the stream is fast flowing, the climate is hot and very exhausting, and altogether it's a hell of a job getting the stuff up to the troops. When the boats reach the rapids, they have to be unloaded. Nepali porters, who are camped near the spot, carry the cargoes overland to a point above the rapids, while the empty craft are hauled upstream. From the river head, supplies are taken up to the front by mules, each beast carrying a load of 160 pounds on a journey which lasts another 10 to 15 days. Somehow the sure-footed mules do the job, but what a job it is.
As the campaign to retake Burma moved on, supply by air from the RAF and the United States Air Force continued relentlessly.
New film has just arrived showing supplies being dropped by the RAF to the 5th Indian Division during its brilliant encircling movement which resulted in the capture of Tiddim. Supply by air was a vital part of General Slim's whole plan in Burma. No praise is too high for the RAF. Flying through mist and cloud above the jungle, in among the mountains and valleys, with the utmost regularity and precision, they dropped food, ammunition and equipment without which the plan could never have succeeded.
With Tiddim recaptured, the forgotten army was at last on its way to getting back Burma. Generally, 1944 had been a very good year for the Allies in the Far East.
Japan's periphery of outposts has been pierced by air-sea power. Americans and Australians have carried the war back to the Philippines, while British, Indians, Americans and Chinese have converged through northern Burma on the old Burma Road. Meanwhile, the Japanese have made their bid to invade India and have been thrown back by Britain's 14th Army. The Japanese are potentially, in the future, a greater danger than Germany. For all their dignified hoodooism, they're savages, barbaric in their conceptions of honor and treachery.
Any country that is unified very fast, as Germany was and as Japan was, and then became very successful, as the Germans were against the French in 1870, and the Japanese were against the Russians in 1905, the military get on top and they stay there. And Japan, by the 1930s, was a thoroughly militarized place. The children were, boys and girls, were taught how to march, they were taught how to sing patriotic songs, engage in pseudo-military exercises. There was a very, very heavy military atmosphere in Japan. I mean, the training of a Japanese soldier was very brutal. They were bashed regularly. And when they bashed us, they would say, well, this is what we got when we were training to be soldiers. they were brutal because their orders were that prisoners must not escape, and if they attempt to escape, they should be killed. And of course, they shouldn't exist. According to the code of knighthood, which the military in Japan had carefully promulgated at the end of the 19th century, and which was very much pressed by the military bosses in the earlier parts of this last century, it was a disgrace to be captured. You should die for the emperor. And they couldn't understand why we were prisoners at all. They said to me many times, "You should be dead. Why aren't you people ashamed of being captured?"
Another film dispatch shows the capture of Kennedy Peak, which was the next Japanese stronghold to be taken after the fall of Tiddim. As we know, the 14th Army has since pushed on very fast along the road to Mandalay. But this is how they beat the Japs in the Battle of Kennedy Peak. It was jungle fighting, a form of battle at which the Japs once thought they had it all their own way. But the men of the 14th have long since taken their measure. These pictures of the battle leave no doubt about that. Beaten back and hunted out from their strong points in the jungle, Japanese survivors abandoned Kennedy Peak and retreated south. It was another victory for the 14th, but they know that the Japs are resolved to fight all the way. For in spite of defeats, the Jap still believes in the superiority of his race and the divinity of his emperor.
The campaign in Burma has been gaining impetus, and in the capture of important centers like Kalewa and more recently Schwebo, powerful assistance has been given by our airmen.
At the start of 1945, General Slim had issued his orders for attacks on Meiktila and Mandalay. If successfully taken, these key objectives would show that the Allies were well on their way to the reconquest of Burma. But there was still a long way to go, with strong Japanese forces east of the Irrawaddy. As the Allies advanced, supplies were pouring in from India by road, and more importantly, by air. Even the guns were sent over the jungle to the front lines in the faithful Dakotas. Slim soon realized, however, that the Japanese were falling back, giving ground towards Mandalay.
General Slim expected, on previous form, for the Japanese to fight extremely strongly to defend the Irrawaddy on the plains of Schwebo. But the Japanese didn't do this. They concentrated their forces to defend Mandalay. And this meant that Slim had to completely recast his plans at the last moment. This he did brilliantly, because he felt that he could actually surprise the Japanese by pretending to line his forces up to attack Mandalay. But at the same time, he would move a very considerable force to their south, towards Meiktila, crossing the Irrawaddy and then attacking Meiktila. If he could take Meiktila, the Japanese defense of Mandalay would be severely compromised, because no reinforcements or supplies could reach them, and inevitably they would be defeated.
An airstrip near Meiktila, and the Jap lines only 3 miles away. The Japs themselves were a lot nearer. Snipers pestered the airstrip from a few hundred yards range. Gurkhas brought by the planes set about unloading. It had to be done quickly, and they got the time a plane was on the airstrip down to 8 minutes, too short a time for the Japs to do anything about it. Then everything was set for the advance.
In March 1945, fighting around Meiktila was severe. The British superiority in armour and the use of air supply broke Japanese resistance.
Meiktila little more than a name on a board when it was taken. firepower, overwhelming in its weight, had smashed the town, and with it the Japs who tried to hold it. With the capture of Meiktila, the Allies had cut the main road and railway between Mandalay and southern Burma. And so the 14th Army set out on the final lap of the long and bitter road to Mandalay.
General Slim's forces, advancing from the north, had massive logistical problems to overcome on the road to Mandalay.
Then foot sluggers of the 14th pushed on across rivers and through jungle in steady pursuit. Fording a shallow stream is probably one of the least of the difficulties encountered, but it can never be said too often or too emphatically that the greatest obstacle is the climate itself. Almost all the time it's exhausting and enervating in the extreme. And when you reach the banks of one of Burma's big, fast-flowing rivers, like the Chindit, for example, you build a bridge across it, and that's a pretty hefty job in any climate. This Bailey Bridge, which the sappers constructed in 26 hours, is claimed to be the largest of its kind so far built in this war, 1,096 feet long. It was thrown across the Chinwin near Kalewa, though that's not how the men who sweated to build it would describe the undertaking, but it was the only way the 14th could get their guns and heavy equipment across to continue their advance.
As General Slim advanced across the central Burmese plain against bitter resistance, the British on the Arakan coast launched another offensive. The aim, as before, was to capture the airfield on Akyab and Ramri Islands, which meant that an assault on Rangoon could be launched.
The occupation of the island of Akyab on the Arakan coast in Burma was preceded by a careful reconnaissance by air. The anticipated flak was conspicuously absent. In fact, it was obvious that the Japs had cleared out. About the only sign of life was provided by a number of Burmese waving to the airmen. The bombardment which had been planned was cancelled, and our first combined operation in Burma was carried out unopposed. Here's a part of the invasion force going in. Looks like the North Africa or D-Day operation in miniature. Anyway, it was successful in every respect, and Akyab, so long held by the Japs, was occupied by men of the 14th Army, the force consisting of Indian and United Kingdom troops with their armour.
The Japanese on Ramri Island offered some resistance, but soon capitulated.
It's certainly good to know that at least a few of the men from Burma are home on leave. You wouldn't expect any heroics from them, even if they do find Britain a bit chilly this January. But one of them, home after 3 years in Burma, has a few typical remarks to make. Sergeant Douglas James.
Well, I guess it's a bit warmer out there than it is in here. I'm quite glad to get back to the wife and kid and sit round my own fire.
Back in Burma, the advance on Mandalay continued with attacks by RAF liberators of the Strategic Air Force Eastern Air Command.
One of these attacks was made on the railway yards at Pin Manar, which is roughly halfway between Rangoon and Mandalay. The object, of course, was to cut the Japanese supply line and hamper the sending of supplies and reinforcements northwards to the defense of Mandalay. Tons of HE and thousands of incendiaries went down on the target. Another attack was made in support of the new front, now being opened up in Arakan. The target this time was Tangup, which is on the coast just south of Ramri Island, where British troops have recently landed. Tangup was the principal Japanese supply base on the Arakan front. 6 waves of liberators went over and unloaded on the dump, which was dispersed in a jungle district near the village.
During early 1945, the Chinese under Stilwell had not been idle. By March the 7th, Lashio had been overrun by Chinese forces. This action was to end the campaign in northern Burma as General Slim's forces braced themselves for the battle for Mandalay.
These pictures, taken just before Mandalay's capture, show units passing a pagoda on the road to the city. They also show the troops enjoying a Burmese entertainment in between battles, so to speak. Burmese dancers were one item on the program of what they call a POW, or variety show. Here, at any rate, with all due respect to ENSA, local talent sufficed. Burmese boxing proved equally popular. They have their own local rules, of course, and it's an affair of slap, kick and scratch. First to draw blood is the winner. A Burmese champion presently challenged all comers. He was taken on by an Indian havildar from the Punjab, who in a short, sharp bout made the champ's nose bleed and won the battle. There was also a display of chunlin, a kind of Burmese football, so skillful that it may well repay our own football talent scouts to visit Burma. But the 14th Army doesn't often get shows of this sort. Lord Louis Mountbatten, in a recent broadcast to his forces, described the sort of show they've been putting on for the benefit of the Japs.
You have fought right through the monsoon, giving the Japanese no chance to reorganize themselves. You have fought and marched and flown over some of the most difficult country in the world, parts of which, before this war, had been visited only by the most intrepid explorers. You have done all these things against the background of what are perhaps the most difficult lines of communication in any theater of war. To all of you, in every arm and every service, British, American, Indian, African and Chinese, I send my grateful thanks. I look forward with confidence to even greater victory.
With Meiktila captured, the Japanese at Mandalay were doomed.
The fighting in Mandalay was very bitter because Mandalay itself allowed for a number of natural strong points for the Japanese to defend. And the fighting was extremely severe, especially around the old temple and castle, Fort Dufferin, built by the British, which was honeycombed with underground passages and subterranean entrances and exits through which the British had to fight and drive the Japanese out of it. But overwhelming artillery, tanks and fighter ground attack eventually ground the Japanese down.
The battle for Mandalay Hill was over, but the remaining Japanese forces retreated into Fort Dufferin, a natural fortified stronghold in the center of the city. Allied guns and the RAF got to work on them.
Arakan fighter bombers and the use of 5.5 medium artillery at point-blank range blasted holes in the walls of Fort Dufferin, and the British were able to take the fort.
A few prisoners are brought in, a particularly interesting event because of its rarity, for the average Jap still seems to prefer to surrender. The breaching of the walls of the fort preceded the storming of the citadel. Here's a 5.5 pounding away at point-blank range. A pagoda at one of the gates of the fort was also an important target because the Japs were using it as an artillery observation post. The pagoda went up in flames, and soon afterwards all Mandalay was ours.
For close on a fortnight, the Japs held out. Then they cracked. The capture of the fort completed the story of the fall of Mandalay.
The Japanese withdrew.
whole British campaign in the Irrawaddy Valley, of which the capture of Mandalay was the culmination, has been conducted by General Slim's 14th Army with consistent brilliance. The enemy was outguessed and outmaneuvered at every turn. To Mandalay came the Supreme Allied Commander of Southeast Asia Command, Lord Louis Mountbatten. The Allied victory was celebrated at a ceremony in Fort Dufferin, presided over by General Slim. The Japanese marched into Mandalay on May the 1st, 1942. Just 3 years later, the Union Jack once more floated over the city, and Mandalay had become another milestone on the road to Japanese defeat.
After the victory at Mandalay, British troops found evidence of Japanese torture on some of the local Burmese. With the war in Europe over, General Slim wasted no time in conveying heartening news to his troops.
War against Japan is going well. Our American allies in the Pacific have won great victories, and we have had our own successes in liberating the greater part of Burma. But the Japanese is a tough enemy, and much must be done before he will admit defeat. But now the resources that defeated Germany are becoming available for use against Japan. Nothing can stop us winning, but a great deal can be done to speed up and render less costly the final victory.
It would have been poetic justice if Slim's army advancing from Meiktila would have been able to reach Rangoon. But before they could do so, the monsoon broke and the advance bogged down in mud. It was therefore easier to launch an amphibious assault after all, and Operation Dracula saw naval forces and airborne troops land outside Rangoon to take the Burmese capital.
From the south came the seaborne attack with naval gunfire in support as well as aircraft. Some Japanese prisoners were picked out of the sea. Although the monsoon had not started, there was already much rain, and the weather and mud proved as great an obstacle as the Japanese. The Japanese had evacuated Rangoon itself, and the seaborne landing was unopposed. Burmese citizens gave the British and Indian troops a warm welcome, both bananas and eggs being on the liberation menu. The capture of Rangoon marks the end of the campaign for the liberation of Burma and the start of another campaign to wipe out the 200,000 Japanese still remaining on the mainland in Siam, cut off from their armies in China.
The 14th celebrated the recapture of Rangoon with a big victory parade. Unfortunately, the weather didn't exactly play the game, but these pictures give us an idea of the sort of thing that the men out there have to put up with, even when they take a day off to celebrate. Lord Louis Mountbatten, CMC, SEAC, took the salute as the men who have fought the Japs through jungle and monsoon swung past. For the men themselves, it's only a halting place on the long journey to Japan itself. They've still a long way to go. And if it rains at their first real victory parade, it won't make any difference. Sooner or later, there'll be another, better, bigger parade in Tokyo. And the 14th will be there, rain or no rain. Another heartening sign of the times is the return of the governor, Sir Reginald Dorman Smith. Aboard a cruiser, he lost no time in conferring with the Burmese themselves. And no time or effort
With the
must be
British
lost in
governor back
preparing
in
the
office,
ravages of
the
Japanese
war in
occupation
Burma
and
had come
restoring Burma
full
for the
circle.
years of peace to come.
In June through to August 1945, the Allies had the job of clearing up the Pacific Islands and pushing ever closer to Japan itself. The battles were sometimes horrific, but the biggest problem of all was to force the fanatical Japanese to surrender.
A horrifying picture, yes. But the atomic bomb is more terrible still, and the Japs must take it or surrender.
The dropping of 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was probably the single most controversial episode of the Second World War.
Most of the city appears to have been obliterated. 4 square miles of desolation are reported, but it's noticeable that a number of steel-framed buildings are still standing.
The view now was that here was a war-winning weapon that could be used to defeat the Japanese without the necessity of a very bloody invasion of the mainland. Approximately 80,000 Japanese died in the Hiroshima blast.
From one point of view, one could almost argue that the atomic bomb for us was rather a good thing. It was at the right moment because I had displeased the camp commandant because I had said, well, really, that it was high time that they realized there was an international convention for reasonable treatment of prisoners. I was not kindly treated and thrown into solitary confinement for quite a long time. And by the end of the war, I had blackwater fever and was in a pretty dicky state. But my comrades, I remember, came in and broke the place open and got me out.
Here at Nagasaki, the explosion was concentrated on an area of 1 square mile, which was delivered 3 days after the attack on Hiroshima. And even more complete destruction is said to have resulted.
The atomic bombs brought Japan to its knees.
When MacArthur himself landed on the Atsugi airfield, about 18 miles from Tokyo, Japan's fade-out as a power and an empire was very near. As the American planes came roaring in, the Japanese went trudging out. For them, the bitterness of total defeat was only just beginning. MacArthur's staff gave sharp orders to Japanese officers, and every precaution was being taken against treachery. From Atsugi, the scene changes to the battleship Missouri. This great ship provided the stage for the end of the drama and the final curtain.
Precautions were taken against Japanese treachery, and it is now known that they had hatched a plot to bomb the Missouri in Tokyo Harbor.
MacArthur, coming aboard, is greeted by Admiral Nimitz. The pictures that follow show the highlights of the formal surrender ceremony, the whole of which lasted only about 20 minutes.
Will General Wainwright and General Percival step forward and accompany me while I sign?
MacArthur then put his signature to the document using 2 pens, one of which he handed to General Wainwright, thin and haggard from his captivity. The other he presented to General Percival, a prisoner since Singapore. Then, briefly, he rang down the curtain.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed.
These pictures of Japanese prisoners in Burma reached London just about the time Japan's unconditional surrender was being signed aboard the Missouri. Some of the prisoners were taken when the Jap force trapped west of the Mandalay Rangoon Road tried to break out. Others were captured in the Pegu-Taungu area. In each case, they were in far larger numbers than usual, and in each case, the men were in pretty bad shape. Thousands of their comrades had been killed, thousands more died of disease or starvation in the forests. Already, the end of Japanese power was in sight.
Elsewhere around the Pacific and in Southeast Asia, local Japanese forces surrendered.
This is the story of the return to Singapore and the Japanese unconditional surrender there.
It must have been a fine sight for the people of Singapore to see British and Empire troops in the streets of the city again after 3.5 bitter years of occupation by Japan. And Japanese guards were made to remove barricades at prison camps as well as many other places on the island. As for the prisoners, well, we may have thought there's a cigarette famine here at home, but we haven't known the half of it. Reports of atrocities and ill treatment followed thick and fast upon the liberation of Singapore. The facts of the situation are far from complete. Indeed, many relatives still await news of husbands and sons. Although in this film we see only a few of almost 200,000 captives liberated by SEAC, most of them, here at Changi, for instance, appear to be in better health than was expected. And sooner than expected, Singapore had been reoccupied without the great assault which had been planned. The town was almost intact. Thousands of lives had been saved. And now the Supremo, Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, was there in person to receive the surrender from the Japs. He enters the municipal building where the surrender is to be made. And here come the Japanese, General Itagaki and his crew of Army and Navy officers, who were marched along under strong guard and booed by the crowd. This is a picture we've all been waiting to see for a very long time. Then, in his own time, Lord Louis entered and indicated that they could sit down. Here's an extract from what he told them.
I have come here today to receive the formal surrender of all the Japanese forces within the Southeast Asia Command. I wish to make this plain. The surrender today is no negotiated surrender. The Japanese are submitting to superior force, now massed here.
General Itagaki signed on behalf of Field Marshal Terauchi, who really was ill. Lord Louis had that checked up. Itagaki had been reported as a fire-eater, breathing defiance to the end, but he signed on the dotted line. Lord Louis's signature accepted the Japanese capitulation. More boos and jeers greeted Itagaki and co. as they were marched away. Then the Supremo read his order of the day to the parade, with thousands of the people of Singapore watching and listening. General Slim, that great British commander, was by his side.
I wish you all to know the gratitude and the pride that I feel towards every man and woman.
In each case, the surrender ceremony was an elaborate affair, largely to impress upon the Japanese that they had truly been defeated.
You are to stand no nonsense from these people. You will have my support in taking the firmest measures against any attempt at obstinacy, impotence, or non-cooperation.
The ceremony wasn't yet complete. The Union Jack had still to be hoisted. This was the flag about which Lord Louis had already said.
In 1942, the Japanese ordered that the Union Jack and a white flag should be carried through the streets of Singapore. In reply, a British officer explained that no Union Jack was available, as all had been burnt. The Japanese accepted this explanation. The officer concerned retained this Union Jack in Changi, where it was used for funerals. It has been handed back to me for hoisting ceremoniously on this historic occasion.
After the Supremo had called for 3 cheers for the king, he drove through vast Singapore crowds, Chinese, Malays, Indians, and the rest, and I think we can all judge for ourselves as to the population's reaction to the return of peace, justice, and freedom to the city and the island of Singapore, to Malaya, and to all Southeast Asia. And this was the scene of surrender at Rangoon, where the airfield had been crowded from an early hour on Sunday the 26th of August. There was delay, and Lieutenant General Stopford, commanding the 12th Army, and other senior officers sat down to wait for the Japs. Eventually, about 3 hours late, the white Japanese planes arrived. Chief of the surrender envoys was Lieutenant General Numata, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Kanterauchi, and with him were Rear Admiral Chudo and Colonel Tamura, all suffering heavily from loss of face, though trying hard to conceal the fact. Numata was received by Major General Symes, commanding the South Burma district, formerly Deputy Chief of the Chindits under Wingate. The Japs were then removed in a vehicle looking rather like a prison van. They were being taken to the place where they were to sign, namely Government House, Rangoon.
I mean, you've got the Germans, but with their Holocaust, but I don't know which of the two was the worst. I mean, the Japanese were equally devilish, I'm afraid.
Sickness, disease, starvation, brutal treatment, seldom any mail or Red Cross parcels, little, if any, news from the outside world. Such had been their lot for 3.5 years. But that's how the Japanese treat prisoners.
I hated the Japanese with everything in every bone in my body, because not only did they bust both my eardrums, and I have to wear a very high volume hearing aids now, but they also, when I got home, I was unable to have any children for 10 years hospital treatment before my first child was born, and then 7 years before the next one. So I hated the Japanese, all right.
At Changi, Singapore Island, a Japanese war criminal was recently executed. Lieutenant General Sukei Champei convicted of ordering the execution of a large number of Australian prisoners of war. Volunteers from the Northamptonshire Regiment carried out the sentence. A grim picture, but not so grim as the crimes the man had committed.
Their behaviour towards wounded people, absolutely disgusting. And their treatment of prisoners.
Many are too ill to come home yet. They're being nursed back to health in hospitals. A lot of them have been taken to India.
Absolutely disgraceful. As I say, their civilization about less than skin deep. I didn't trust them then, I wouldn't trust them now.
And I remember then being taken to a hospital with a lot of others, and Lady Mountbatten came as a sort of angel and just sat and held our hands.
In Singapore, the Supremo and Lady Louis make a complete tour of inspection of the POW and internee camps. He saw the conditions in which our men and women had been existing. He obtained first-hand, on-the-spot information about Japanese behavior. Without the slightest doubt, wherever he went, Seletar, Changi, Woodlands, Sime Road, and the rest, he collected more and more evidence of Japanese cruelty. If we stress the point now, it's because it's a point we can't afford to forget. Those prisoners fit enough to travel are now coming home in a number of big ships. The first of them arrived on Sunday the 7th of October. She was the liner Corfu, and she brought 1,134 ex-prisoners of war to Southampton. Their cheers pretty well drowned the cheers from the crowds waiting at the dock to welcome them. They were all soldiers except for a few naval men and one man of the Royal Air Force who was the first ashore, Corporal Percy Toms of Ewell, Surrey, and Jack Cotter of Wolverton was there to greet him.
I'm very sure she'll be very pleased to see you. Well, and may I welcome you home. Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure this welcome here has been really excellent. It's surpassed everything that I ever imagined. Good day, Corporal, and good old eye. Thank you very much.
Humping their new kit, the men came ashore. Far sooner than they dared to hope, they were setting foot in Britain again, the moment they'd dreamed about for years. Everything possible was being done for them, for instance, cigarettes and a snack for each man on his way to the transit camp, then home and 6 weeks' leave on double rations.
What part of England did you come from?
Cambridge.
Cambridge, eh? Good old Cambridge. How long have you been a prisoner?
3.5 years.
3.5 years. Did you had a bad time there?
Not too good.
I bet you're glad to see old England again.
I'll say I am.
Yes. Well, we're glad to get home. You're married?
Yes.
Your wife will be pleased to see you?
Yes.
I bet you will. That's the idea, all right. What about you, Tom? Where do you come from?
I come from London.
Come from London? Oh, Tom, you always find a cockney, don't we?
Yeah.
Where we go? And how long have you been away?
Oh, now, into 4 years now.
4 years, have you? And what's the first thing you're going to do when you get ashore?
Oh, good point of work, don't we?
Find a wallet? Good, blimey, chum, so will I. Come on, they're open. Look, here's the sign.
The second ship was the Monowai, and she came into Liverpool the next day. A lively reception had been arranged here, too, that goes without saying. Just imagine how the returning prisoners felt, servicemen and civilians. No need to imagine how their relatives felt, we can see.
My wife was standing on, I can remember what she was dressed in, even. She had a red kind of tam o' shanter hat with a red coat, and I just couldn't take my eyes off her. And Wendy just stood and stared at this apparition.
Ship after ship is now arriving, and as the prisoners come ashore, this is their homecoming. News from British territory in the Far East includes film evidence that the Japanese are being put to work. These are a few scenes taken recently in Singapore, where plenty of jobs are being found for the nips. And they're being given plenty of work. Our own men were made to work at the double here. Now we compel the Japs to do the same. If there are any of our own returned ex-prisoners in the audience, I hope they're really enjoying this picture.
As Japanese war criminals were rounded up in the Far East, more and more horrific stories of atrocities came to light.
And that's Sergeant Matsuda, personal bodyguard to a Colonel Nomar, head of the Jap Gestapo. Matsuda, they say, used to ride in front of the colonel and behead anyone who didn't get out of the way quick enough. Nice people, the Japs, but it's good news that the worst of them are beginning to be rounded up.
1946 saw many war criminals sentenced.
In Tokyo, the trial of the principal Japanese war criminals began this May under the presidency of Sir William Webb. They're accused of waging wars of aggression and committing wholesale murders. One of them is the bald-headed would-be General Tojo. Another is Dr. Shumei Okawa, sitting just behind him. Watch. Perhaps he found it irresistible. Perhaps he just doesn't like Tojo. More likely still, he hopes to get off by appearing to be insane. Okawa, by the way, is said to have organized the Mukden incident.
Well, I never much cared for them as a nation. I felt their attitude was wrong. I felt that they were a pretty insular lot. They were full of hate.
Anyway, the reading of the indictment went on. They kept Okawa out of slapping distance from Tojo, but he continued praying and crying, hoping, I dare say, that they'd say, "You can't try anyone as crazy as him."
I don't know where they got their hate from, but they had this wonderful, wonderful loyalty to the emperor, but I never really took much notice of them, except that I felt that at times it was all unnecessary.
I didn't have a lasting hatred of the Japanese. I mean, my feeling was that once the military had been taught a violent lesson, which they were, there could be place for the old things that people had come to like about Japan. For instance, their ability in the arts, things that I had been close up to when I was with the Japanese embassy. The bad side was dealt a very heavy blow with the skill of General MacArthur. I know that some people are finding fault with that now, but I think he was pretty wise, pretty savvy. My thought was that we have to look to the future, and I've always felt that.
They went in their hundreds to a land they did not know. There was no welcome waiting, but alas, they had to go. We must never forget them, and as the years roll by, keep them in your minds and hearts, and just for them, smile. Do not cry
The curtain rises on London's Victory Parade as their Majesties leave Buckingham Palace for the saluting base in the Mall. The captain's escort of the Household Cavalry was in attendance, and the royal procession went by an indirect route in order that the crowds might see and cheer their king and queen.
The Burma campaign must be totally unique within the annals of the Second World War. It was always going to be a second priority. The defeat of Germany was always going to be the first priority. And so the army in Burma was always the Cinderella of all armies. It always was at the very end of the queue for equipment, supplies, modern weaponry, fighter ground attack, fighters, whatever. And yet in General Sir William Slim, it had a commander who had commanded it in the worst days of defeat, when it was being hustled out of Burma by the Japanese, who rebuilt it, remolded it, brought it back into Burma, got its ascendancy in jungle fighting over the Japanese by the first Chindit operation, and then decisively defeated the Japanese at Imphal and Kohima. And then, a virtual unknown, he drove the Japanese army through the monsoon at its highest intensity in fighting conditions that were considered to be impossible by most strategists, till he finally pinned the Japanese army to the east of the Irrawaddy and conclusively defeated it. It is an incredible achievement, and an incredible achievement by the British Indian Army, its last major battle before India became independent. 1.5 million soldiers of the Indian Army, the largest volunteer army the world has ever seen, defeated the Japanese in the biggest land defeat of their history. Surely an amazing achievement, the turning of the scales, defeat into victory.
The British defeat at Singapore and the headlong retreat through Burma had been terrible humiliations for the British Empire. Although the British did return, the native peoples no longer held them in the same awe as they once had.
Why not forgive and forget, they say. 50 years have passed away. The old man smiled and shook his head. It isn't 50 years ago, he said. It only seems like yesterday. If I could forget the bestial way my friends were killed and thrown away down into a muddy hole, then peace might heal this grieving soul, but it only seems like yesterday. Forgiveness belongs to those who stay, so young, so dead, so far away. We can't forgive on their behalf, remembrance is their epitaph, for it only seems like yesterday.